Imagine the silence of the ancient desert. Hot sand underfoot, shimmering mirages on the horizon, and somewhere out there, beyond the waves of sultry air, the silhouettes of the majestic walls of an unknown city. A city whose name once made hearts tremble from Constantinople to the farthest corners of India. The city where the sacred fire burned for centuries, where silks and spices flowed in rivers, and emperors wore diadems heavier than the king's dreams. Greetings, my dear listeners, and I invite you to write in the comments what city you are from and what time it is. Today we will go on a journey to one of the most mysterious and powerful empires of antiquity, whose history has dissolved in the centuries like a morning mist, leaving only fragments of palaces and echoes of legends. We will plunge into the world of Sassanid Persia, the empire that for 4 centuries opposed Rome, gave the world unprecedented architecture, and carried the sacred flame of Zoroastrianism through the centuries. Close your eyes and imagine the beginning of the 3rd century AD. The world was a very different place then, slower, more mysterious, filled with the smells of incense and the tinkling of caravan bells. On the territory of modern Iran, the great Parthian power, the Arshakid Empire, which once made even the legions of Crassus tremble, was living out its last days. But time was inexorable. The peasants groaned under the oppression of ever-increasing taxes. The nobility was mired in feuds, and the Roman legions crossed the eastern borders more and more often, like beasts of prey that smelled the weakness of their prey. In this world of decay and chaos, among the sun-scorched hills of Fars, in the heart of ancient Persia, where the kings of Darius and Xerxes once ruled, there rose a man whose name was destined to echo through the ages. Ardashir, grandson of a certain Sassan, a man perhaps of humble origins, perhaps a priest of the sacred fire. This Ardashir looked at the world around him with the eyes of a conqueror and saw not decay, but opportunity. He saw how he could pick up the pieces of a crumbling empire and forge from them something new, powerful, capable of challenging Rome itself once again. Imagine this moment, a warm spring evening in the year 224, when the whole world held its breath. Somewhere on the plain of Or-Mizdagan, under the starry skies of Mesopotamia, 2 armies were meeting. On the one hand, the last king of the Arshakid kings, Artaban V, with all the power of the ancient dynasty, with its heavy cavalry and loyal allies. On the other hand, an upstart from Fars, who dared to raise his sword against the legitimate authority. But sometimes history makes its choice not in favor of legality, but in favor of strength and will. The 20th of April was the day when the last Arshakid fell and a new empire was born. In the dust of that battle, amidst the clang of swords and the shouts of the fighting men, a new world was being born. A world in which the Sassanids would become rulers from the Caucasus to the Indus, from the Amu Darya to the Persian Gulf. But this victory was only the beginning. Ardashir had to conquer 80 local rulers, 80 little kings, each of whom considered himself the heir of Cyrus and Darius. Imagine those years, endless treks along mountain trails and desert roads, sieges of small fortresses, negotiations with proud princes, one after another, bowing their heads before the new ruler of Iran. And now the new capital spread out on the banks of the Tigris. Not one, but two at once, Seleucia and Ctesiphon, like two eyes, looking at the world from both sides of the great river. Here, where the waters of the Tigris carried their muddy waters to the Persian Gulf, where palm trees rustled their leaves in the hot winds, where the air was filled with the aromas of spices and the sounds of dozens of languages, the heart of the new empire beat. Caravans from distant China with silk and tea, from India with pepper and precious stones, from Rome with gold and slaves flocked here. Here, the roads connecting east and west crossed, and every ship, every caravan brought not only goods, but also news, ideas, dreams of distant lands. In these palaces, where marble columns rose to painted ceilings, where fountains sang their watery songs in shady gardens, the policy of the new power was carried out. Shahanshah, the King of Kings, sat on a throne of ivory and gold, receiving ambassadors from distant nations. But his power was not absolute, as it might seem to an outsider. Next to the throne stood other, no less influential figures: the high priests, the Mobadan Mobadas, guardians of the sacred fire and ancient wisdom. There was an invisible but constant struggle between secular and spiritual power, and intelligent kings realized that whoever controlled the temples and sacred fires controlled the souls of their subjects. Imagine this world, a world where society was divided into distinct classes, like the steps of a giant pyramid. At the top were the nobility, owners of vast estates where thousands of peasants worked the fields under the scorching sun. Their palaces were amazingly luxurious: silk carpets from Samarkand, silver crockery from Balkh, incense from Arabia. Below were the Azats, free warriors who formed the basis of the heavy cavalry, proud riders in shining armor, each of whom thought himself the heir of ancient heroes. And at the very bottom were the peasants and artisans, whose hands created all the wealth of the empire, whose sweat irrigated the fields, whose skillful fingers wove the very silks that were valued from Rome to China. But even in this seemingly frozen world, there were opportunities for movement. A skillful craftsman could become rich and buy land. A brave warrior could win the king's favor and gain high rank. A wise priest could rise to the top of the spiritual hierarchy. The empire was rigid, but not hopeless. Life flowed in it, energy buzzed, dreams of a better life were born. And above all this world, above palaces and huts, above temples and bazaars, stretched the dome of the sky, where the merciless sun scorched by day and the stars twinkled by night, the very stars in which the Zoroastrian priests read the will of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light and goodness. In every temple, a sacred fire, the symbol of this deity, burned, and the smoke from these fires rose to the heavens like the prayers of a whole nation. Prayers for peace, for prosperity, for the victory of light over darkness. Centuries passed. Kings succeeded each other. Generations were born and died. But the empire grew stronger, and it reached its highest prosperity under the ruler whose name became synonymous with wisdom and justice. Khosrow, the first Anushirvan, the one who was called the Immortal Soul. Under him, the empire became a perfectly fine-tuned mechanism. The army was reformed and became an obedient tool in the hands of the central government. Finances were organized so that gold flowed into the state treasury, and the bureaucracy worked with clockwork precision. Imagine these times, a time when Sassanid governors ruled in faraway Armenia, when Persian garrisons stood in the fortresses of the Caucasus, when the Shahanshah's ambassadors were received at courts from Byzantium to India as equals among equals. It was truly a golden age, an age when it seemed that the empire would exist forever, like the mountains and deserts that surrounded it. But the golden age is not only wise laws and victorious armies. It is also stone turned into poetry, clay turned into music, space filled with meaning and beauty. Sassanid architecture. Say this word combination slowly. Feel how it sounds. There is something in it, from the rustle of silk, from the ringing of silver bells, from the mysterious echo reflected in the high vaults of ancient palaces. Imagine a dawn over the desert, when the first rays of the sun touch the walls of a city built 1,500 years ago, and these walls suddenly come alive, start telling their stories. Ardashir the First was not only a conqueror, he was a builder of worlds. As many as 9 cities were built by this man, and each of them was not just a cluster of houses and streets, but an embodiment of his dream of a perfect state. Special among all these cities was Gur, a city which the king himself called Artashir Kura, meaning the glory of Ardashir. Imagine how it happened. Somewhere in the first half of the 3rd century, in the sun-scorched valley of Fars, thousands of laborers, day after day, brick by brick, were creating something unprecedented. A symbol city, a mandala city, a city whose shape reflected the very structure of the universe. Gur was round, perfectly round, as if created not by human hands, but by some cosmic circular. The double walls formed concentric circles, between which stretched a deep moat, a water barrier that both protected the city and nourished its life. 4 gates faced the 4 sides of the world, like eyes turned to the 4 winds, the 4 seasons, the 4 elements of the universe. And in the very center of this perfect circle stood a tower, an obelisk or pyramid, within which a spiral staircase ascended to the top, where the sacred fire burned day and night. Imagine this fire, not an ordinary flame fed by wood, but a sacred embodiment of divine light, a fire that was never to be extinguished. An aqueduct led to the top of the tower, through which pure water flowed. Water for the priests who guarded the flame, water for ritual ablutions, water as a symbol of purity and life. Around this central tower, like planets around the sun, were the main buildings of the city, palaces of the nobility, temples of various deities, houses of rich merchants. All of them were surrounded by another round wall, creating a sacred nucleus at the heart of the city organism. But Ardashir was not the only city builder of his dynasty. His son Shapur I surpassed his father not only in military feats, but also in the scale of construction. This king, who defeated Roman legions and captured the Emperor Valerian himself, approached the creation of cities as a commander to the planning of the battle. First the plan, then the calculation of resources, and only then the action. After his victory over Valerian, he founded Bishapur, the glory of Shapur, a city that became a monument to his triumph. And when fortune turned away from the Romans and turned towards the Turanians from the far north, Shapur founded Nishapur, a city whose name meant Good Shapur. It is interesting that Sassanid architects used 2 completely different planning principles. Round cities, such as Gur and Darabgard, inherited the traditions of the Parthians. In them, one could feel the ancient Oriental wisdom, the understanding of the city as a model of the cosmos, as an earthly reflection of heavenly harmony. But rectangular cities, such as Bishapur and Nishapur, spoke of the influence of a different culture. Roman, with its practicality and logic. This is not surprising. After Valerian's capture, thousands of Roman soldiers and engineers remained in Persia, and their knowledge and experience of construction became part of the Sassanian architectural tradition. Imagine Bishapur, a city that emerged as a hymn to victory, as a stone poem about the triumph of the East over the West. Rectilinear walls bounded it on the south and west, and a citadel on a hill controlled the eastern approaches. The main entrance was in the middle of the western side. From here began the parade road leading to the heart of the city. The streets intersected at right angles, creating a clear grid that was easy to navigate. And in the center, at the intersection of the main arteries, stood two columns, two steles over 6 meters high, topped with Corinthian capitals in the Roman style. Shapur had ordered their erection in 266th year to commemorate his victory. And these columns were a testament to how empires can learn from each other, even in the fiercest of confrontations. But cities are not just about layout and walls. It is first and foremost the materials of which they are built, the techniques used by their builders, the secrets of craftsmanship passed down from father to son through the generations. In Mesopotamia and Khuzestan, in fertile valleys where there was no shortage of clay, they continued to build in the old-fashioned way, from raw bricks dried under the hot sun. Burnt bricks were rare, used only for the most important buildings. But stone was the main material of the Sassanid Empire, not the hewn marble of Roman buildings, but wild stone, river shingles, roughly worked blocks, which were laid without special observance of rows and dressings. The secret of the Sassanian builders was the mortar, a fast-setting gypsum compound that turned a pile of heterogeneous stones into a monolithic mass. Imagine the process of construction. Workers lay stones day after day, pour this magic mortar over them, and gradually, as if by the wave of an invisible hand, the wall becomes a single whole, strong as a rock. It was not an architecture of beauty, but of functionality. The walls were thick, massive, able to withstand any load, and the loads were considerable, because in a treeless country, the main structures were arches, vaults, and domes. There was not enough wood even for form work, so the Sassanian masters invented an amazing technique: cross-sectional, non-circular masonry. Imagine how it happened. The first rows of bricks or stones were laid horizontally, each subsequent row slightly overhanging the previous one, creating a gradual overhang. Slowly, patiently, with each row, the vault acquired its smooth curve until finally it closed at the top without any support from below. It was an art bordering on magic to create structures out of heavy stone that seemed to float in the air. It was in the 3rd century in Iran that a design was created that then spread throughout the East. A dome on a square base using trompe-l'oeil. Imagine this challenge. How to put a round dome on a square room. Sassanid architects found an elegant solution. In the corners of the square, they arranged small arches, tromps, which cut the corners and created an octagon. And already on it was easier to put the round base of the dome. True, these early trompe-l'oeil were still archaic, small, built directly into the shell of the dome, which sometimes led to an incorrect outline and even to the fact that the diameter of the dome exceeded the size of the room. But the principle was found, and it revolutionized architecture. For large spans, the Sassanid masters preferred a parabolic curve. It made it easier to mason without a circle and reduced lateral spacing. And the pinnacle of their art was the famous Taki Kisra, Khosrow's arch in Ctesiphon, a giant vault of Ivan made of burnt bricks. Imagine the scale of this construction. The span of more than 25 meters, the height of 37 meters, dimensions that even today amaze the imagination. And the largest dome of that time, in Chor Kapu, covered a span of more than 16 meters. Of course, Sassanid construction techniques were not perfect. Wild stone masonry required extremely thick walls. Vaults and domes were heavy. But it was these masters, it was their engineering thought that prepared the ground for all subsequent development of Oriental architecture. Their experience, their discoveries, their mistakes and successes became the foundation on which the wonders of Islamic architecture grew. And so, when the technical side of construction was mastered, when masters learnt how to build vaults and domes, how to control light and space, the creation of what truly deserves to be called architectural poetry, the palaces of the Sassanian kings, began. Imagine these constructions not as simple dwellings, however luxurious, but as material embodiment of the imperial idea, as stone declarations about the greatness and eternity of the dynasty. Each palace was a microcosm, where each column, each arch, each ornament had its own deep meaning. Ardashir's residence at Firuzabad, built in the year 224, was the first manifesto of the new dynasty. It was a huge, massive, rectangular structure, neither elegant nor refined, but as imposing as the very power of its builder. Entering the main Iwan, a large vaulted gallery open on one side, the guest was confronted with the grandeur of the new order. The Ivan was flanked by smaller vaulted rooms, like guards protecting the peace of the Lord. 3 domed halls and a square courtyard completed the composition, creating a rhythm of light and shadow, open and closed spaces. But Ardashir realized that power should not only be powerful, but also beautiful. The facades of his palace were divided by pilasters with semi-columns, echoes of the ancient tradition that came to Iran with the Hellenistic conquests and remained alive in the hearts of the masters. Doors and niches were framed by plait-bands with Egyptian cornices, another reminder that a great empire should absorb the best of all cultures of the world. And above it all rose arches, not just structural elements, but symbols of the sky, symbols of the divine protection under which the Shahanshah's throne rests. But the real breakthrough in palace architecture was the ensemble in Bishapur, created in 266th year. Here, Shahpur's architects departed from the principles of the Firuzabad palace and created something fundamentally new. The heart of the complex was the cross-shaped auditorium, a room 22 meters wide, with massive walls 8 meters thick. Imagine this space. The high vaults were lost in semi-darkness, and along the walls stretched rows of niches, 64 recesses, each decorated with carved knockers and paintings. Knock is a special material, a mixture of gypsum and fibers, which after drying became as hard as stone, but at the same time allowed to create the finest, almost lacy patterns. In the niches of the Bishapur Palace, the whole world came to life. There were images of flowers and birds, geometric ornaments, symbols of royal power, and painting added to this white lace a play of colors, gold and ultramarine, cinnabar and malachite created a fantastic symphony of color, which in the light of torches had to produce a truly magical impression. The audience hall adjoined the courtyard, an open space where the courtiers gathered during ceremonies. Beyond the courtyard was the triple Avon, 3 parallel galleries opened into the courtyard by 3 grand arches. The floors of these Avons were covered with mosaics, not simple paneling, but real works of art. Small cubes of colored stone and glass were arranged in complex patterns depicting people and animals, feasting and hunting scenes. But all the previous buildings paled before the main structure of Sassanid architecture, the palace at Ctesiphon, the famous Taki Kisra. It was a construction that surpassed in scale everything that the Sassanids had created. The main Ivan of the palace was astonishing in its size. Its vault was so large that a whole city could be placed under it. Behind the Avon was a vaulted hall, and the walls of the building were flanked by galleries with arches on pillars. These galleries served not only for beauty, but also to support the huge vaults. Imagine a reception in the palace of Taki Kisar. The ambassadors of distant countries, climbing the wide staircase, found themselves in front of a gigantic archway, which seemed like a gateway to another world. Their footsteps echoed in the vast space, and somewhere in the depths, in the semi-darkness of the vaulted hall, the ruler of half the world sat on a golden throne. This palace was to inspire not only respect, but also sacred awe. The feeling that not just a man dwelt here, but the viceroy of Ahura Mazda on earth. A few centuries later, in the 5th century, a palace was built in Sarvistan, smaller but surprisingly elegant. Its architecture was similar to that of Firuzabad, but the main accent was the dome rising high above the walls. This 5th century dome was the first to feature a notched cornice, a decorative element that would later become a characteristic feature of Islamic architecture. But the Sassanids did not only build palaces. In the rocks of Taki Bustan in the 4th and 5th centuries, amazing grottos were carved, artificial caves that served as part of a suburban hunting residence. The smaller grotto, created for Shapur III, was decorated with bas-reliefs depicting the king and deities. But the larger grotto, attributed to Khosrow II, was a real treasure trove of art. There was a figure of the winged goddess of victory, a high relief of Khosrow on a horse in full battle attire, scenes of the king hunting deer and wild boars. Imagine these images. Not flat, schematic drawings, but three-dimensional sculpture, where every fold of clothing, every mane of the horse, every leaf on the trees were carved with amazing skill. Here, art served not only decoration, but also propaganda. Everyone who saw these images had to realize that in front of him was not just a king, but a hero, the defender of his people, the winner of enemies. The 6th century dwellings that have survived in ruins show that the principles of palace architecture also penetrated into private housing. These houses were two-storied, with vaulted ceilings, quadrangular courtyards, and quoins. They were divided into front and living parts. Public and private spaces were clearly demarcated. The main Iwan and the reception hall were richly decorated with carved knockers and paintings, and the orientation of the Iwans took into account the change of seasons. In summer, they faced north, towards the cool winds. In winter, south, towards the warming sun. But the most amazing, perhaps, were the cult buildings, temples of sacred fire, where the flame burned for centuries. The most common type of such a temple was a chortak, 4 arches. Imagine a square pavilion made of stone, crowned with a dome, with 4 arches open to the 4 sides of the world. In the center of this pavilion, on a special altar, a sacred fire burned. Nearby, there was always a second, closed room where fuel and sacred utensils were kept. And there must be water nearby, a spring, a well, or an artificial reservoir, because fire and water were inseparable in the Zoroastrian religion. Chortaks were built not only in cities, but also in the desert, on caravan routes, where they served as beacons for travelers. Imagine a caravan walking through the desert at night. Only stars and endless sand ahead. And suddenly, a light flashes in the darkness, beckoning to you. It meant not only the direction of the journey, but also a place of rest, safety, human warmth in the middle of the desert. The Temple of Fire in Naysar was a more complex construction. A cubic building 12 by 12 meters under a dome on 4 arches. It is interesting that the materials of the building changed from bottom to top, as if the architect wanted to show the path from earthly to heavenly, from gross matter to divine light. But stone, however beautiful, is only a shell. The soul of the Sassanid Empire was a religion as old as the mountains of Iran, as wise as the starry sky above the desert. Zoroastrianism. Say this word quietly. Taste it. It has echoes of millennia, the whisper of prayers, the crackling of sacred flames, the eternal struggle of light and darkness. This religion was born in the first millennium BC, somewhere in the Iranian highlands, when the world was still young, when people lived closer to the gods and further away from doubt. Zarathustra is a name shrouded in legend. Who was this man? A prophet? A priest? A poet? Or perhaps all of these at the same time? In the ancient hymns of the Avesta, he appears to us as a preacher of a new faith, as a man who dared to challenge the old gods and proclaim a new truth. Imagine this man standing somewhere in the steppe, under the endless sky, his voice traveling over the parched grass, over the flocks of sheep and goats, telling people about the great battle that is going on in the universe, about the choice that every human being faces, about the meaning of life and death. His teachings did not initially meet with understanding in his homeland. As is often the case with prophets, Zarathustra was forced to flee, seeking refuge in other people's homes, and he found it with a ruler named Vishtaspa, who became his patron and first royal follower. When did this happen? Scholars argue to this day. Some say the 17th to 15th centuries BC, others the 6th century. But are the exact dates important when it comes to eternal things? What is important is that somewhere in the depths of the ages, a voice was heard that changed the spiritual life of an entire people. Zoroastrianism was based on a simple and, at the same time, the deepest idea: dualism, the struggle of two beginnings. On the one hand, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the creator of all good and light, the embodiment of justice and truth. On the other side is Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit, the source of darkness, lies, and destruction. And in between is a man endowed with freedom of choice, capable of tipping the scales to one side or the other. Imagine a world where every act has cosmic significance, where a good thought, a good word, a good deed become a weapon in the great battle of light and darkness. Zoroastrianism was not a religion of renunciation from the world. On the contrary, it called for active participation in life. The increase of material wealth, the development of cattle breeding and agriculture, the birth of children, all this contributed to the victory of good. Asceticism was rejected as a service to evil, because the denial of the pleasures of life meant the denial of the creations of Ahura Mazda. Fire, water, earth, and air are the four sacred elements of Zoroastrianism. But a special place among them was occupied by fire, the embodiment of Arta, divine justice, all-pervading and all-purifying power. In every house burned the home fire, in every temple the sacred flame, and in the main sanctuaries of the power blazed great fires, some of which did not die out for centuries. The Zoroastrians were obliged to take constant care of these elements, to guard their purity, to protect them from desecration. The sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, the Avesta, have not survived to us completely. The canonized list was kept in the main sanctuary in Shisa, but time is ruthless. Wars, fires, and persecutions have destroyed most of the ancient manuscripts. What remains consists of 3 main books. The Yasna includes the most ancient hymns, the Gathas, written in verse by Zarathustra himself. Imagine these verses. They contain the prophet's voice through the millennia, his passion, his faith, his pain for humanity. The Yashtas are 21 hymns glorifying the various deities of the Zoroastrian pantheon, Mithra and Ardvisura Anahita, containing ancient Iranian myths and legends, and Videvdat, a code of laws on ritual purity, detailed rules on how to preserve the sacred elements from defilement, how to purify oneself after contact with the unclean, how to take proper care of fire, water, earth, and useful animals. Interestingly, the Avestan alphabet was created only in the 6th century AD. Before that, sacred texts were transmitted orally, from teacher to student, from generation to generation. This alphabet, based on the Pahlavi script, contained a huge number of letters, 14 vowels alone, in order to convey the sound of the ancient prayers as accurately as possible. Zoroastrian cosmology represented the history of the world as a 12,000-year cycle, divided into 4 periods of 3,000 years each. The first period is the pre-existence of ideas, when Ahura Mazda conceived the creation. The second is the actual creation of the world, when the evil spirit invaded the creation and brought evil into it. The third is the period before Zoroaster, the time of mythological heroes such as the just king Yima. And the fourth is the period after Zoroaster, when saviors must appear every 1,000 years. And at the very end will come the Saoshyant, who will raise the dead and defeat the forces of evil forever. The life of the Zoroastrian community was permeated with rituals and customs designed to maintain the link between man and the divine world. 5 times a day, the faithful said prayers, facing the sun or south in Iran and north in India, where some of the community later migrated. Cleanliness was the most important requirement. Touching a dead body, blood, or impurities was equated with sin. In every house, there was a special room for impurities and rubbish, so as not to defile the living rooms. The Zoroastrian funeral rites amazed foreigners with their unusualness. The corpse was considered a source of defilement, so only special servants, nasasalars, corpse washers, could touch it. The body was exposed to the sun in special structures, towers of silence, dakmas, where wild animals and birds cleaned it from the flesh. Only after that, the bones were put into rock niches or special boxes. The rite of Sagdid, the presence of a dog with the dying person, was obligatory because it was believed that a dog's gaze expelled evil spirits. Zoroastrian holidays reflected the religion's connection with natural cycles. Nowruz, the new year associated with the vernal equinox, was the most important of them all. The festive table was decorated with 7 dishes, candles, an aquarium with goldfish, a mirror with an egg, flowers. Each item had a symbolic meaning. The 6 Gahan bars celebrated the change of seasons. Mehregan glorified Mitra, the deity of contract and oath. But Zoroastrianism was not the only religion of the Sassanian Empire. In the 3rd century, Manichaeism emerged, created by the prophet Mani, who tried to combine elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. Manichaeans preached renunciation of property and ascetic way of life, which contradicted Zoroastrian ethics. Mani was executed in 276, but his teachings continued to spread. At the end of the 5th century, a Mazdakite movement emerged, partly based on Manichaean ideas. The Mazdakites claimed to be dedicated to conveying the true meaning of Zoroastrianism. which had been distorted by the priesthood, and fought for the establishment of social equality. King Kawad supported them for a time, but in 529 the movement was suppressed and Mazdak was executed. Christianity, too, found its place in the empire. Until the 80s of the 5th century, Christians were persecuted as potential allies of Rome, but then they received legal rights. The Nestorians, who were seen as allies in the struggle against Byzantium, were especially favored. The great confrontation between Sassanid Persia and the Roman Empire, later Byzantium, lasted 4 centuries. It was not just a struggle for territory. It was a clash of 2 worlds, 2 civilizations, 2 ways of understanding life. The wars were fought with varying success, without bringing decisive victory to either side. The main theaters of war were in Armenia and Mesopotamia, those eternal apples of discord between East and West. Ardashir I began this struggle, trying to regain the lands that once belonged to the Achaemenids. Shapur I continued it with even greater scope. In 243rd year, the Romans were defeated at Massis, where the Emperor Gordian III died. And in 263rd year, there was an event that shook the entire ancient world. Shapur defeated the 70,000th Roman army and took the Emperor Valerian in captivity. Imagine this triumph. The Roman Emperor, the vicar of the gods on earth, is led in chains through the streets of Ctesiphon, and then, perhaps, working on the construction of the Band-e-Kaiser Dam. But Rome did not give up. Odenathus of Palmyra successfully fought the Persians, driving them back from their borders and even reaching Ctesiphon. In the year 283, Emperor Carus captured the Persian capital, but his sudden death prevented the success from developing. Centuries passed, generations of warriors changed, but the war continued. Under Shapur II, the Persians sought the complete subjugation of Armenia and the introduction of Zoroastrianism there. Julian the Apostate undertook a grandiose campaign against Persia, but died in battle, and the peace concluded after his death was disadvantageous for Rome. At the beginning of the 5th century, relations improved. Yezdegerd I proclaimed freedom of worship for Christians. In the year 422, a peace was concluded that guaranteed an end to religious persecution on both sides. But the peace was short-lived. Under Kavad I, the Anastasian War broke out, then the Iberian War. Under Khosrow, the first Anushirvan, the Eternal Peace, was concluded, which lasted only 8 years. The apogee of this centuries-long confrontation was the last great war under Khosrow, the second Parviz. After the assassination of Emperor Mauritius in the year 602, Khosrow, who considered Mauritius his benefactor, refused to recognize the new emperor and started the war under the pretext of revenge. By the mid-20s of the 7th century, the Sassanids had reached the peak of their power. They controlled most of Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Persian troops were even besieging Constantinople. But Emperor Heraclius managed to turn the tide of the war. He reformed the army, invaded through Armenia into the heart of Iran, ravaged Aturpatakan, and destroyed the sacred fire temple of Atur-Gushnasp. In the year 627 at Nineveh, he won a crushing victory, defeating the Persian army. Khosrow fled, but was soon deposed and killed by his own son. The long war exhausted both empires, but Persia was the stronger. When the young Yazdegerd III, grandson of Khosrow II, came to power in 632nd year, he controlled only a part of the weakened state. And then, trouble came from where it was not expected, from deep in the Arabian Peninsula. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the year 632, the Arabs began their rapid conquest of the world. In the year 635, they defeated the Iranian armies at Qadisiyah. The battle lasted 4 days and was fierce. 30,000 Muslim warriors faced an army gathered from all regions of Iran. The Persians used war elephants and built a dam for crossing. But on the 4th day, a hurricane west wind, which blew sand into the Iranians' faces, helped the Arabs defeat the center of the Persian army. Rustam, the Iranian commander, died in the battle, and the army, shaken by the death of its commander, turned to flight. After Qadisiyah, the Sassanid power rapidly disintegrated. In the year 637, Ctesiphon fell, and by the year 651, the Arabs had taken possession of almost all Iran. Yazdegerd III was murdered in his sleep in Merv, and the great empire ceased to exist. The Arab conquest brought a new religion, Islam, to Iran. Zoroastrians became Zimmiyas, foreigners under protection. They were guaranteed life and the right to practice their faith, but they were obliged to pay jizya, per capita tax. Caliph Omar ordered the destruction of the fire temples, but the clerics bought them back, and many temples continued to operate. In the 8th to 9th centuries, the majority of the population converted to Islam, but there was still a significant Zoroastrian community in the province of Fars. The increasing persecution forced groups of Zoroastrians to leave their homeland. There was no mass exodus, but there was a gradual resettlement. The Parsis, as the Persian Zoroastrians came to be called, settled on the western coast of India, where they retained their customs. The Mongol invasion was a disaster. Temples were destroyed. Sacred books were destroyed. The Zoroastrians took refuge in remote areas, in Yazd and Kerman. There they built simple temples of raw material, so as not to attract attention, and lived outside the city walls, in houses with special halls for house altars. In the 19th century, the number of Zoroastrians had dwindled to a few thousand. They suffered severe material hardships, paid jizya, and were subjected to arbitrary taxes. But in the second half of the century, the Indian Parsis began to help their co-religionists in Iran. The 20th century brought some relief. The Pahlavi dynasty took an interest in Zoroastrianism, seeking to use the ancient tradition to strengthen the monarchy. Zoroastrians gained the right to elect a representative to the Majlis and began to hold public office. But after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the situation worsened again. According to the new constitution, Zoroastrians are recognized as a religious minority, but do not actually participate in the public life of the country. So ended the history of a great empire, an empire that for 4 centuries was equal to Rome, which gave the world amazing architecture and carried through the millennia the sacred fire of the ancient faith. Today, this fire burns only in a few temples. The community of Zoroastrians is small, but the memory of Sassanian Persia lives on, in the ruins of palaces, in the texts of the Avesta, in the hearts of those who remember the time when the East was great and proud. And may this story, this memory of the lost East, warm your dreams tonight. Good night, my dear listeners. See you in our next night journeys through the labyrinths of time.